Good afternoon. See everybody's seated. Thank you very much. You're in session 2C, which is not written there, but outside, so that you know, in case you're in the wrong session. This is about transparency in the financial sector. My name is Albani. I'm the director of Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 at the World Economic Forum, and I'll be the moderator of this session. We have a very interesting panel to discuss two important big growth in big data and analytics that is applied not only to what happens on the ground biophysically, not only to the flows of goods between different players, and we've seen there is a different session that is discussing that, but to the finance that goes behind the companies that are operating the supply chains of forestry's commodities, to the governance of those organizations who has ownership, and so shining a light of potentially radical transparency into the way commodity production and commodity trade is both financed and governed. And then the question is, can we actually bring this light of radical transparency enabled by big data and analytics to the operators at the forest frontier? And if we do that, can that actually have an impact on deforestation rates? Can that actually help us reduce deforestation? Is the lack of transparency, is the lack of visibility on who's doing what and who's financing whom to do what that is enabling deforestation today? And if that's true, what can we do to accelerate massively? We have been instructed that we should not be talking about changing things at the margin, but really scaling up effort so that we see a massive shift of pace in the adoption of these transparency approaches and really see the change in the deforestation rates. I have a great panel to have this discussion that I would like to invite to join me on the stage. I have Carole Ferguson, who's the head of investor relations at CDP. Gabriel Thoumi, who's the director of capital markets at Climate Advisors. Laode Syarif, who's the commissioner for the Corruption Eradication Commission in Indonesia. And last but not least, Sabine Miltner, who's the program director for conservation and financial markets at the Moore Foundation. And all of you have been chosen to join us on this panel because you bring different perspective to this question. And I would like to go to Gabriel first, because there is a background paper for this panel who I'm sure everybody has read and pored over for hours at, with burning the midnight oil, that has described this revolution that is happening. I thought maybe, Gabriel, you could help us. Those of us who are kind of slow learners and need to read it 3 or 4 times to understand it, what is this revolution? What does it promise to do, and why does it matter for the forest frontier?
Thank you, Marco, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, NORAD, for the invitation. And most importantly, thank each and every one of you for spending some time today with us to talk about radical transparency. We can agree on a couple of things for today's conversation. One, we can agree that agriculture drivers are a direct cause of deforestation. And 2, we can agree that there are and do exist indirect drivers of deforestation. So the purpose of today's conversation is to focus on that second bucket, the indirect drivers of deforestation, which we have some information on. But what we do lack is radical transparency, or basically transparency of the financial and corporate governance information associated with companies that are indirect drivers of deforestation. So you might ask me, who are these companies? These are the companies in the financial services industry. These are corporations that are buyers of agricultural products that sit downstream in supply chains. So like this morning, we were challenged to have a big vision. And we have a big and very clear vision for you today. We want each and every one of you, wherever you live, in a forest country, in New York City or Hong Kong, whether you are live in a forest, whether you are work in civil society, or law enforcement, or in government, or you live in the agricultural frontier and operate a small shop there, or you work in a corporation, or you're like me, you're an investor. I want each and every one of you to have free and transparent information today on these indirect drivers of deforestation. I want all of you to have the access, wherever you may be, to transparent financial information and corporate governance information at the company level and at the sector level, the bottom up and the top down. Why? Let's talk about that for 1 second, and then I'll pass the panel to the other excellent participants. I want you to have this information now at the sector level, because when we have surveyed the sector level, which we did in a pre-pilot over 2 years, we looked at over 100,000 points of data, 70 different companies, hundreds and hundreds of executives. We're able to map over 7,000 institutional investor positions and map 2,500 board interlocks when an executive has more than one position in the same industry, which is, in most countries, a legal violation of corporate law. We found that in one industry, in one country, two companies, which are the two companies that are driving deforestation on the ground in that country, two of the leading deforesting companies in that country, had 60% of the legal violations in their industry. Top down, surveying that data, making it public, provides an opportunity for you to have power, to have action, to stop deforestation wherever you're at. Let's look at the bottom up. We looked at a separate company, and we were able to discover financial accounting fraud. Fraud that existed for 4 years. The result of this, that company devalued the price that it had placed on those plantations, and it decreased the risk of conversion of those concessions to plantations. So the summary point is, with free and transparent information today, you have power to impact and stop deforestation where you may be. Where you have the possibility to impact the indirect drivers of deforestation by communicating effectively with mainstream financial actors and mainstream corporations. And this will provide power for you to be able to take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. So this was the perspective of how investors can use this and fundamentally use this data that is becoming more and more available to change the outcomes and the way corporations behave at the forest frontier. Laode, you're the commissioner for the Corruption Eradication Commission, and from your point of view of government and taking this information to the objectives of your commission, where do you see the opportunity and where do you see the impact coming from?
Yes, I think, first of all, thank you very much for the government of Norwegia for inviting us from the KPK to come and to share our little bit of experience in this particular topic. And some people may think, what is the relevance of Corruption Eradication Commission with forestry, for example? I think before I answer your question, I just want to, for those of you who are not familiar with the KPK, Corruption Eradication Commission of Indonesia, we have 5 functions. We do coordination with government agencies and staff. We supervise corruption cases conducted by the police and Attorney General Office. we also do corruption preventions involving many actors, including CSO, government official and private sectors. And lastly, we do investigations and prosecution of big corruption cases. So we are only focusing on big corruptions. So, talking about the importance of like a big data in Indonesia, whether it will help the government in Indonesia to reduce the opportunity of corruptions, of illegality within forestry sectors, I would say yes. But it is the most important factor that needed for the Indonesian government or Indonesian people. I may say no. Why? As just Gabriel mentioned, they are direct driver of deforestation and sometimes indirect driver of deforestation. And I think why I'm saying it, for example, since the SBY governments more than about 15 years back, we are starting to discuss about the importance of to have one map for the whole Indonesians. We are still working on it until today. Are we stupid? No. Do we have the capacity to do it? Yes, we have. Do we have international support? Yes, we have it too. But why it is unfinished until today? Even though us as a capital keep pushing to do it. I think the main challenges, actually the main problem with that is that a lack of openness within the government's agencies. I gave you an example. In order to have a good map, we need all the information from many relevant government departments. But when particular governments that responsible to make this one big map, they never actually give them the information to make the map. Why? Because by giving the informations, they are going to open up many illegalities that have been conducted in the last 50 years. Give you an example. In North Kalimantan, north of Borneo, the size of licenses for mining are much, much bigger than the actual size of the land of that particular provinces. So by surrendering the data, they say, hey, and it will catch my attention and I can go for them.
So you're saying that what's really needed is to be able to open up the databases of the government.
Yeah, that's what, yes. So that's why we are in the KPK now actually working with many relevant agencies, asking them to provide the data. So I keep inviting them to come, including Paroi, for example. If you are going to use law enforcement, for example, he found out that this particular area maybe is not belong to the particular person. He needs the data. But sometimes if he needs data from land agency, the land agency say, no, I'm not going to give it to you. So they need me to mediate them. I've been conducting several meetings in the KPK and asking them. For example, the cultivation right, the utilization right. The NGOs even actually sued the land agency to the court. And the court say, this is public data. You have to disclose it. It is about 3-4 years already, this particular decisions. they still do not want, even they want to give it to us, but not to the Ministry of Forestry.
That's very interesting. And
Yeah.
I guess
So before you continue, the most important one for the Indonesian case is that fixing the governance of it. It is not about technicality. Because we have drone, we have satellite, and we have a big brain too in Indonesia. And we know how to do it. Yeah. So we would need actually fixing the governance, curbing corruptions, and we need the president to say it so, give them a timetable. Okay, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Lands and Agriculture and extra, can you please, I give you 1 month to disclose everything.
Okay.
So I think that's the most important.
I'm going to stop you now because I
Yeah.
think this is, to some extent, is a little bit outside the scope of this panel, but I think it's a very interesting angle to it because
Yeah.
it shines where the light needs to be, and sometimes the light does not need to be on the corporation, it's to be
Yeah.
on the government organization. And it raised a question in my head, but I'm going to set aside because I want to ask Carole, your responsibility is fundamentally is providing transparency to investors on the risk, right? That's what CDP does. So when you look at this conversation and how this fits with what your day job is and what your organization is trying to do, what's your reflection? Can we actually get the relevant information and is actually useful for achieving change?
Right. So, I mean, the question here is, can big data create the transparency for the right actors to take action to stop deforestation? And at CDP, we're very much involved with one subsector of that. So we're asking data from companies in various sectors on what kind of, how they're managing their exposure to forest risk commodities. So we're looking at how they're managing their risks on soya, palm oil, timber and timber-related products, and cattle. So, you know, we're putting the spotlight on companies to tell us what they're doing, and that data is then being relayed to investors to see if investors can take action to stop any bad practice. And that's essentially what CDP has been doing for a while. So CDP has a history of trying to drive transparency through disclosure. And we started doing that many years ago in the area of climate change. You know, we've been doing that for 15 to 17 years. And for the last few years, we've included water and forestry. And you know, what's quite interesting is to see the experience between the kind of transparency we've been able to achieve on the climate change side versus what we've seen on the forestry side. So we send out questionnaires every year. And last year, for example, we sent out to 838 companies and asking them to disclose their both risks, opportunities, and governance on these FRCs. And these companies were from a whole range of sectors. So they're downstream companies, so involved in the consumer goods sector, in retail, so the L'Oreals of the world, the McDonald's, to companies right through the value chain, so agricultural companies, the big agricultural traders. And what we found that, you know, out of the 838 companies that we asked to disclose on these risks, only 23% responded to CDP. So the level of disclosure in terms of data is still very low for the forestry side and very low compared to, say, climate change and water, where we have double the response rate for a much larger universe of companies. And then, you know, the good news is, you know, we can say we have over 200 companies now disclosing to CDP on their risks and opportunities on FRCs. And the other good thing that we note is that the commitments being made by companies have risen quite a lot from 2012 to 2017, but that's plateauing. And when you actually scrutinize those commitments and look at what companies are actually doing, there's a gap between companies that are making commitments and the action that they're actually taking. And I've got some more sort of statistics. So, if you look at the number of companies that say they have time-bound commitments, you have about 28%. But then if you look at companies that actually have time-bound commitments that are actually linked to zero deforestation, that percentage comes down to 13%. So that's very interesting. So, you are getting disclosure, but maybe not the quality of disclosure that you really need. And then more importantly, in the supply chain, we find that 72% of the companies that respond to CDP say they're managing their operating risks related to these forest commodities, and they are managing their growth plans as well related to these commodities. But actually, only half those companies are finding out beyond their first tier of suppliers what they're doing. So, that's really disappointing because you don't really get the disclosure in the supply chain, and that's where the action might be. What we have found has been successful is last year, for the first time, we included in our supply chain program forestry. So we've had climate and water as part of that. And our supply chain program essentially allows big companies, so we're talking about, again, L'Oreal, McDonald's, the bigger companies, to ask their suppliers what they're doing about their exposure to forest risk commodities. And that's very powerful because you have big companies asking detailed questions right through the supply chain. So going out to medium and small size companies. And that's where you get not just bigger data, but you get more meaningful data. And that's where I think, we can really drive some change. So in answer to your question, I think we're starting to see some very, very good data coming out of the companies that are reporting to us, and where companies have made good quality commitments, they're followed up with good practice. But we need to scale that up.
Okay, very good. Sabine, you have two interesting hats for this conversation, right, that you can take on. And then you have your Germany hat because of the game. That's it's a third one. We'll keep to the first two. The first one is as program officer of the Moore Foundation. You lead the markets and conservation markets and financial markets effort. So you're funding work in this area. What's your reflection from what's coming out of it? Do you see this as a big opportunity where we need to double down?
So perhaps just it would be helpful if I could just step back for a second and just put things a little bit in context of what we do. So I'm leading, as you said, the conservation and markets work, which is focused on agriculture, on finance, and on seafood, and essentially to decouple food production from ecosystem degradation. So that's the bottom line. We do fund a lot of transparency, both on the corporate side and also in seeing what is going to be useful for the financial industry. So on the corporate side, we have been focused on supporting Trace and supporting GFW Pro that helps financial institutions and companies. We have explored areas of artificial intelligence where you could consider with the right mapping tools to even predict for the enforcement people, perhaps more relevant even, where could the crime take place tomorrow, or where is some illegal logging or some illegal something happening tomorrow. So I mean, these are all areas that one could explore. I think sometimes I'm a little bit worried about the plethora of tools that are popping up and platforms that are being created, because, you know, in my experience from my former job is that, you know, there is a lot of potential confusion out there on what to use, what is the credible tool to use, who is going to go after you because you have used the, quote, wrong tools, etc. So I think there is a lot of conversation that needs to be had, including with funders thinking about, you know, how many of those different platforms should be really supporting. I would say at an early stage, at an experimental stage, it is worth kind of trying to see what might stick, and maybe there is actually a market mechanism by which at the end of the day, you know, the best tool wins. I think it's very important to also note, I mean, to what Gabriel was saying, I was actually struck. He said 2 companies in one sector accounted for 60% of the legal violations. I wonder, is that something that we need to, how do we best shine light on that, right? I mean, do we need, you know, build big data platforms to come to that conclusion, or is that pretty obvious? And frankly, again, from a financial institution's perspective, should they, I mean, through the standard due diligence that financial firms are doing when they are onboarding clients, et cetera, you know, track record of the client is one thing. But if you, either from a banking perspective or from an investor perspective, if you are thinking about, you need to be also concerned about what is it that they are going to do. This is where the commitments, of course, come in. Very important to understand the quality of these commitments. That's why it's so important that we have the accountability framework initiative, which, you know, we are also supporting, to have comparability of what this all means that companies are committing to. And then financial institutions also need to have an understanding of what's the capacity of those companies to implement those. And, you know, so there's a lot of qualitative assessment that I think behooves financial institutions well. And, you know, we should not, I'm not saying I'm against big data, I'm just saying we should not think that there is like a new silver bullet that is going to solve something where, you know, pretty basic due diligence and credit analysis, etc., is required in order to, you know, to do the business in the first place. So that's just to start us off.
Thank you. That's a very good reflection, right? To some extent, we have seen during the financial crisis that risk had been packed away, you know, 2-3 steps away in places where then the investors couldn't see them. And do we see actually now risk created by deforestation or created by the commitments to end deforestation being packed away into places where it's going to come up and hit the investors? And maybe that's the one angle that we can grab. But before we go there, I just wanted to go back to Laode, because I had a very interesting question that came in my head by listening to you, and it was that on the other side of these concessions, there's a private company who has received a concession. And those concessions are material elements of the value of that company. And is there then a way, or maybe there isn't, by which the disclosure can actually come from the company side?
Yes, I'm quite happy with the presentation this morning. One of the big companies in Indonesia is actually saying they are going to improve the governance within their companies. And one good point that he made, that it is the consumer drive here are going to push them to be more transparent, because they do not want to associate themselves as a bad company, especially they are on stock exchange, for example. And for the time being, actually, KPK, we are also developing our own, I won't say that it's a big data, but I think it's big enough for our needs. For example, I have an access to every companies that actually registered within the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Human and Law and Human Rights. So we have that data. But in central, in national level, we do not have data, for example, quite a good data for the companies operating within provincials and district level. But we are in the process of to have that. The second drive, apart from the consumer, us and the KPK now, I think we are going to focus on corporations, because in the past, we always prosecuting individuals. Now we have several companies actually are going to prosecute companies. And I think this sends quite a good signal to the companies, Indonesians, for example, and also the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Now they are actually suing companies. So I think the combination of those two actually maybe will create a new good environment, so that the company actually they want to associate themselves as a good company, so that maybe the transparency can come from them. In this morning session actually I raised my hand, but I kind of like hesitate. But if the moderator asks me to ask a question, then I will ask him how many hectares that actually they have as a concessions. Because that's the most important ones.
Yeah.
1 million hectares or less than 1 million hectares. So if you say 1 million hectares, which is more than the size of Singapore. Sometimes we don't know that, 1 million hectares, it's not that big. No, it is just the size of Bali. Yeah. But being in a KPK, now I have to be very careful. Even to ask questions, you know. Yeah, so, but...
Well, you're a webcast, so...
Yeah.
Now,
It is okay then. But this is, but for the sake of transparency, I think this is very, very basic question. This need to be asked.
Yeah. But it's
Which,
a very good
I
point.
mean, if, okay, I have a concession in Sumatra, in what coordinate, for example?
Yeah.
In the north, in the south, this is not rocket science at all, because in the license, it is clearly written.
But I have
Yeah.
been in meetings with some of these big companies, and where those questions were asked, and the answer was, come to our data room, we will show you where the concessions are, but we are not allowed to share this data with you by the government. So that, and you're telling me that that's not the right answer,
Yeah.
if I understand correctly.
So it's why it is not the lack of data sometimes, but it's the lack of willingness. And I think the government's responsibility has to push for more transparency. I think it is stupid for the government not to push for transparency. Give you an example. This is real data, and I give you an example. For example, the preventing state losses in Indonesian forestry sectors. An analysis non-tax forest revenue collection and timber product administration. For example, estimated of actual production from natural forest in 2003-2014, based on the very good estimations and also agreed by the minister about 70 million of cubic meters. But the reported production, it is about 10 million of cubic meters. So how much the revenue should they pay for the government?
So-
This kind of, so if the government asks them not to disclose the data, I would say this is very wrong government.
Okay, very good. Indeed. There's a very interesting point here that comes from your point, which is we're going after this company. So this creates real risk, financial and legal risk for companies, and creates a duty for those who are running those companies, but also those who are invested in those companies to take that into consideration. Gabriel, I understand that with Climate Advisors you have been looking at this issue of the legal risk dimension. Can you comment on that, and how big do you think this is an opportunity for the forest and climate community to actually get real change at the forest frontier?
I can comment a bit. I can share the following. Obviously, this is webcast, and it's public. So there was a group of us, some institutions, that did a 6-month-long project. We worked with former U.S. federal prosecutors who are specialists in Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-money laundering, and other institutions who have also worked in this field. There's an exhaustive amount of research. It's private. I cannot share it with you. But we did publish a summary article last week in mainstream financial press on this issue. And what's very interesting is that when I approached the mainstream financial press, and I was like, I'm going to send you a draft of an article that says investors have financial risk, have a legal liability and legal risk if they have deforestation in their supply chain and labor rights violations in their supply chain. I wasn't sure what the response would be. I mean, their audience is BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, Japanese pension fund, Norwegian pension fund. This is mainstream financial press. And they were really interested in the article. And the article was the #1 article that day in the press. Why? Because mainstream investors, mainstream financial institutions, when we speak to them as peers, we ask them, how can I help? We share information. We don't blame them, right? We're all in this together. We all live on one planet. There's not another planet where they live, right? When we work together, they're very interested in what we have to share with them. And why? So what happens is if a company cooks its books, lies about its financial statements, that can be a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation. Think of all the agriculture traders and agriculture companies in the world that you know. Their real assets in their balance sheet, sorry for the jargon, but their real assets, how they value their concessions. How do they value those? If it's me, I have 100 hectares, I think I'm going to make it $1 million. Why? Because I'm going to make that argument. Probably the valuation is $2,000, $5,000. But they overvalue their assets on purpose to then take that overvalued asset and take it to a banker in our banking community to get a loan for short-term lending, short-term loan. And they use those short-term loans to then add an inflated amount to get a bulldozer, to hire people to clear-cut the forests. And we suspect, but we do not know for certain, but we suspect that this is systemic across the industry. We have caught 2 companies doing this. These are very large companies. So That's an example of a potential Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation. You also have securities law violations. When corporations whose securities share equity and debt trade on U.S. exchanges, they lie about their financial statements, that can be a violation and sent to the Securities Exchange Commission. Now, that's a lot of jargon, so let's step back. Why does this matter? On the one hand, we have ethics and morals behind the argument to stop deforestation, to protect our planet. We need to for our children and our grandchildren, for our communities and for the biodiversity we care about, for the water, for us, for our hearts, our souls. Separately, we have a second argument. There's financial risk. There's excellent organizations describing financial risk around agricultural production, such as Chain Reaction Research and many others. But now we have a third argument. There's a legal risk. And when you make a legal risk, such as a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or an Anti-Money Laundering Act, suggestion to a bank, those banks must reply. It's required by law. So I think we can use those three, close the loop, and push for greater disclosure. But what do companies have to lose? If they're doing the right thing, that's great. If they're not quite doing the right thing, a little bit of disinfectant, a little bit of sunlight will help them along the right path. And so we firmly believe that disclosure is part of the innovation that we need right now, and we need it as a sector, and we need it rapidly.
Carole, is this something that the investors that work with CDP are asking for right now?
Yeah, I think investors are interested, and all the same investors that Gabriel has been talking about, very big institutional investors, are interested in this disclosure and the data. But I think what we need to do is to try and, despite the fact that data is not just quantitative, it can be qualitative, we need to put it into context for them. And we need to be able to sort of firstly get more data along the supply chain, and then put it into, I hate to use the word metrics, but there are useful metrics to work out the companies that are doing the good things, to encourage them to keep showing good practice, and shine the light on the companies that are not doing so well, and maybe just showing them where they're not doing well. And investors are interested in that. We've done that for a long time in climate change, and they are interested in that. And actually, when they're looking at forestry, they probably originally came at it from a climate change angle, but now are also interested in the risks related to those other commodities. And I think that it's going to grow from here. Different types of investors, but generally the trend is for growth in interest.
Thank you. Sabine, you spent a long time in the financial industry, and some of these risks are not risks that are taken by investors directly, but might be taken by financial intermediaries as they underwrite loans or revolving line of credit or whatever it is that they are doing. Is your sense that the financial industry is aware of this, the riskiness of this sector, and what do you think we should be doing about that?
Yeah, so I think this is, it depends, who do we talk about when we say the financial sector, which is clearly not a homogeneous bunch. And, if you look, for example, at the companies or the financial institutions that several years back joined the Banking Environment Initiative and came up with this soft commodity compact, those banks, these are large international financial institutions, I think they probably sleep reasonably well at night about their exposure to deforestation risk, I would think, because certainly over the last, whenever this started, 2012 or 13, there have been a large number of years, and they have promised to clean their portfolios from players that are not good players, which comes back to that due diligence that I've mentioned earlier. And in that particular case, it was, you know, also facilitated by saying we commit to certain certification schemes that we use as our external process for due diligence. So because, you know, ultimately it's very difficult to envisage that individual large institutions for activities that don't make up a huge part of their overall activity, that they acquire specific skills to, you know, or have tons of people on the ground, you know, so they need to somehow farm it out to someone. And so a certification scheme is certainly certainly one way. You know, some of those analysis that others might be doing with regard to legality or illegality is certainly something that people would be looking at. But then you have the question: well, how many of the bad apples are actually banked by those people who actually take things seriously? You know, the Europeans and the U.S. Financial institutions and some of the banks and investor in Asia and so on, who have begun to look into this. And of course there are when you look at, you know, who is funding sort of the bad apples, you know, it's none of these organizations are really at the top of the list, right? So then how do you get to the smaller banks, the smaller regional banks, the local investors in some of these markets where, you know, it has been the way of life, right? So, and then how do you deal with that? So that's why I'm saying the financial system is not homogeneous in that regard. And, you know, all the good information that CDP is putting out or Gabriel's shop is putting out will be absorbed very differently by different players. So then this comes back to your point, right? I mean, how much do we need to require the government to step in and to support? You know, if you think of Brazil, the central bank has certain requirements on banks and ESG disclosure and so on, which I'm sure is supporting more broadly than also a focus on deforestation, because that is their business over in Brazil, where so much exposure is clearly there to the agricultural sector. So I'm just saying there is, you know, I think there is not a one size fits all. I believe disclosure in general is very important. Yeah. I think the issue of you know, materiality, though, then becomes ever more important. For example, as part of our finance work, we are essentially pushing for, you know, a disclosure that is sort of the TCFD for food. I mean, it's not quite perhaps going that far, but it is using the same kind of basic parameters of you know, companies disclosing their material risk, disclosing the process by which they are making their decisions in key areas, using scenarios, etc. So I think there is disclosure is very important, but, you know, as I said, it's deforestation is not necessarily material for every financial institution that we are.
So we need to zoom it in where it is material.
Yes.
And a lot of it is going to be at the interface of the financial accounting and the inflation of the assets, because people are using financial practices, inappropriate financial practices to inflate or hide what they're doing or get more loans, or is going to be at the interface of legal
Yeah, I mean, the moment something, I mean, I've always thought, legality is a really important hook in that space, because deforestation alone is just not enough to get to financial institutions.
Yep.
It's just going to be too small. I like the idea of having deforestation much more embedded into the climate
Yep.
discussion. I mean, if we are thinking about that deforestation, if it were a country, right, as Francis always says, would be the third largest emitter. So, putting it into the climate discussion will potentially be more fruitful from a purely materiality perspective. Legal or illegality is, of course, immediately material, right? Because everybody would get extremely disturbed. Every legal counsel of every company or firm I've ever come across would be extremely disturbed to be
You
confronted
mentioned the
with that.
TCFD, so I think it's helpful maybe for the audience to the task
Oh,
force.
sorry, the task force on climate disclosure. What's it called?
Climate-related financial disclosure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
This is the Financial Stability Board.
yes, but the
So-
point is
Yeah.
to integrate sustainability, to not treat sustainability as sort of like a sideshow, but have it integrated into the financial disclosures.
To the
And this is
mainstream
where the
disclosure
contact- where
requirement.
the issue of materiality, of course, becomes.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about the TCFD framework is it looks at the risks and opportunities side of the balance sheet, as well as governance and strategy. And, I think what it does is it gives companies the chance to actually be innovative and coming up with, areas where they can improve. So it's not all just about managing risk. And then importantly, as you say, trying to carve out what is material, what can make a difference on both sides of the balance sheet.
So we have legal risk, we have financial risk, we have big data that is giving us the opportunity to look at that in a more effective way.
Yeah.
We need to bring it up to the right audiences, and we also need to look in the right places, which might not necessarily always be companies. I want to give the opportunity for some of the questions from the audience to come in now, because we have been going on for about 45, 50 minutes, and I think we still have a good chunk of time left. This session is booked for an hour and a half, but even if my thing is flashing that we're over time, I believe we still have another... It's over time to go to questions. So the first question I see is, if investors want more disclosure from companies, as Carole says, why can't they force it given the power they have as shareholders? This is a very interesting question. And
Yeah.
do you want to try to get...
Yeah, and actually we use the power of shareholders to ask companies. And I think that, we couldn't drive as much disclosure as we did if we didn't have investors behind us.
Yeah.
So, and don't forget, disclosure is still voluntary. So the whole point about the TCFD framework and the whole, task force on financial related stability and, the sort of central bankers promoting TCFD is about, should we take this from the voluntary side to make it mandatory? Because, all the disclosure and all the data is voluntary. And I think shareholders are pushing that, but, there's only so far they can go. And actually what we find is when shareholders work collaboratively, when they actually start tabling shareholder resolutions, like we did, for example, we saw that with Exxon having to disclose on their exposure to climate change. That's where it becomes really effective. When you have a whole group of investors tabling a shareholder resolution and asking those questions. But I think the problem is, I don't think people really understand deforestation necessarily in the same context. And that's where you need to do the data, the analytics, inform the investors, and scale up that whole process.
Yeah, and possibly there is another angle that the shareholders that you the investors that you work with, they don't necessarily have majority stakes in any of these companies. And so their power to get change is not automatic.
No, but actually what's interesting is we did a piece of analysis and we looked at, say, the top 20 or the top 40 shareholders of some of the big companies involved in this area, whether it's consumer goods or agricultural companies. And actually, some of the stakes are, they're not meaningful, but when you add them together, and when these groups act together, they can actually have enough ownership to make a difference.
If Andrew Steer were here, I don't know if he's, Andrew Mitchell were here, I don't know if he's here, but he always makes this point of like, do you have a pension? Have you asked your pension fund whether they're invested in the companies that are having deforestation? So I think there's a role also for the NGO and activist community to basically ask our pension funds whether, I don't know whether my pension fund has it, I don't know if they know it.
But I think it's, just to jump in here just for a second, I think it's important what we mean by a company having deforestation, right? What does it mean? Does it mean they are somebody on the ground who actually deforests? Mm-hmm. Or where is it, how far would you call it out in the supply chain, right? Yeah. And, the retailers, they have, I have from a totally different sector, I just happen to know one mega large retailer who at some point told us that they had 1.5% of global tuna. So that is tiny, right? And then if you think about how that distributes over all the vessels and all the companies that are somehow involved in tuna, that makes it, again, it makes it very small, and that is, so where do you draw the line? And when is somebody linked to deforestation? When do they contribute to deforestation? And when do they actually cause to deforestation? And I think, I don't think that we have really actually, even for ourselves, really fully determined where do we want to draw the line in terms of on the supply chain, and how, how much what do I request from the consumer goods companies, who, of course, we want them to manage their supply chain, but then would I file a shareholder resolution against them because, there is a fractional exposure given the size of their business to somebody in Indonesia who is caught by our friend of having done the wrong thing? So.
Yeah, I guess the question is, can we actually get more investors to ask these questions about disclosure? Yeah. I think there is an opportunity there. I want to go to the next question. I think we have more, right? Yeah. Okay, and sustainable practice risk I guess that's risk as a verb. And sustainable practices risk the companies and their investors. Some investors are not entirely aware about it. What can be done to increase the awareness among investors? I think this is probably a good question for our entire panel. Who feels have a good perspective on this?
So I've been working for many years as an investor and previously in banking before joining Climate Advisors, and engaging with the companies I invested in, the companies we lent to, primarily the companies I invested in on their sustainability risks and opportunities. What we did is very clear. We have first thing, communicate effectively. Use information and terms and phrases that make sense to my audience. But to do that, number two, I have to know exactly who is my audience in the corporation. Right? Number three, take that information and iterate and work with who I talk to. One of the very best results I got was I filed a proxy resolution against the U.S. exchange. A proxy resolution in U.S. securities law is not friendly. And I used CDP data, because CDP data is very powerful, it's audited, you do an excellent job. And that individual called me the day before a major holiday in the United States. And the first thing I said to the individual is our first conversation was, you know, it's a day before the holiday. Please just go home. I'm the last person you need to worry about or talk to today because this person will spend the next week with their family. And they're like, well, we have a deadline. I'm like, you know, just not worry about it. We'll work it out. We treated each other with respect. We treated each other as peers. So within a year, that corporation has made a very big difference in how exchanges globally address environmental social governance risk. Today, the World Federation of Exchanges made an announcement based on that research that we helped trigger 5 years ago. The World Federation of Exchange is a trade association for all exchanges globally. And they made an announcement on environmental social governance risk. So when I forensically look back at many experiences like that, one, speak simply and easily, communicate effectively. Two, do not blame. Three, share financial facts. Four, ask them for what are different ways they can provide some solutions or see what do they understand, because they are always going to understand their business better than me. I've done a lot of work in palm oil, but trust me, any palm oil grower and trader in the world understands the business more than me, right? Treat them with respect. Ask, simply state, number 6, simply state, how can I help? That simple phrase, how I can help, here are some financial facts, what do you think, what are some solutions, has created a whole set of positive interactions and outcomes, right? Which is very different than when I started in this field many years ago, 13 years ago. I thought I had to educate people that trees were important and deforestation risk was material. No. The corporate executives that I've had the good fortune and the luck to talk to, they all know this, you know, that deforestation risk is material, that trees matter, that climate change is happening. They may not know what to do. So it provides a sounding board for them to iterate with them. So effective communication is my number one and only thing I focus on.
So effective communication with investor, effective communication with operating companies on their financial consequences and financial facts that are relevant for investors. You want to say something?
Yeah, I would just perhaps offer also one thing, and that is, you know, even though we talked about materiality and something may not be material today, but, you know, there is the possibility of something becoming material tomorrow, right? Because of regulatory regimes also changing in that particular space, forest codes being implemented where they don't exist or tightened where they already exist, which will change the equation for you know, for people being exposed. So it is perhaps not the strongest hook, but it is certainly something that investors should be educated about, that this is, like we saw on climate, and how relatively quickly things have moved over the last few years. Something similarly. And as I said, again, the more we tie the deforestation discussion also at the national level in terms of the NDCs and everything, what countries committing to, into the climate conversation, I think there is much more leg. And I do think the legality and the drawing the distinction between legal and illegal deforestation is definitely something investors should be clear about. And banks.
May I add just one quick thing, if you don't mind?
Yes.
Thank you. It's important to understand that risk does not operate in isolation.
Right.
Sometimes, I would suggest rarely, is there a single risk and a single cause and effect. Whether it's regulatory, business, financial, any adjective we put in front of the word of risk, often they are pooled together and they cascade. We look at what happened with Lumber Liquidators. It's a very large U.S. publicly traded company that's involved in flooring. Wonderful wooden floors that happen to be a little bit too inexpensive, one might suggest. It turned out, through wonderful work from some of our colleagues here, EIA and many others, that they were able to demonstrate that a significant portion of the timber they were using was illegally sourced and stolen out of Russian protected forests, laundered through Chinese markets, then relabeled and entered the United States as Chinese timber. So that's one risk, right? We catch them in that. A $13 million Department of Justice fine for both under the Lacey Act for environmental violations and for customs violations for labeling their product wrong and illegally. Yet, that same company had a second, more important risk, one might argue, the use of formaldehyde in its flooring. Many people, when they found this out, I know people who ripped the floors out of their house when they found out how much formaldehyde apparently had been illegally put into the flooring. And these are some very conservative people that I know who did this. So when one risk occurs, often there's another risk. So if you see something, it's like little breadcrumbs and the mouse. Follow the mouse. Thank you.
That's very interesting because it puts in context, like, how do we call the attention? We have stories, right? These are stories. And one thing I want to ask about Laode was, do you talk to investors about the work that you're doing? And is this something that you think investors should know more about as they are investing in Indonesian companies?
Yes, I think I have to admit it that the KPK kind of like quite late in involving private sectors. It is only recently then we are targeting companies that we are starting to draft a special guidance for companies operating in Indonesia. Yeah, there are now a lot of interest from chambers of commerce. They're coming to us, but then again, still in the beginning. And I think it is the responsibility of institutions like the KPK to give more information, not only to the investors, but also to the Indonesian companies. I have, it's sometimes quite difficult to understand Indonesia, but I give you an example. I was invited by Chambers of Commerce to open up a seminar on good corporate governance. So I went there in one of the good hotels in Jakarta, and I met many parliamentarians, many high-ranking officials. I was expecting to meet business people. And it turned out they are also members of Chambers of Commerce because they have big companies. I mean, but I don't really think this is actually unique in Indonesia. And sometimes in other part of the world, actually, they try to hiding it. And they are essentially given an so yeah, sometimes I find it is quite hard to understand, but it is the reality. And I think it is not only in Indonesia, even in many other parts of the world.
That's right.
Yeah. So, but then again, it is very, very important. And I think we have to take it seriously because you cannot build the economy of the country without the involvement of good corporations.
Very good. So,
And another one, it is a real case. For example, out of the blue, the serious fraud office in UK actually called me. And they said, this is very urgent. Can you send your investigators to UK this week? And I say, on what case? Just come. This is very important because this is involving, for example, Indonesian airline companies. And at the same time, we already, in every, not every, but in many occasions, we consider this particular state-owned company is one of the cleanest in Indonesia, for example. And Rolls-Royce is a very good company, its image. Garuda Indonesia is very good company in Indonesian standard. But this is the crown jewel of British industry. And you see, they are still doing a lot of wrong things. And this is a real case and still under the investigation between us. You know? And in US too, there's slumbers and Alstoms, and it is involving Indonesian, unfortunately. Yeah, so I think this is very, very important.
So we have an opportunity
Yeah.
to make these cases known better to the investor community and
Yes.
raise their profile. And this is something that doesn't necessarily pop up
Yeah.
in the agenda. Sabine, you want to say something?
Yeah, so my only slight caveat on this one would be that, you know, we don't want to create a sector that people are scared to be involved in, because A, there are clearly companies who are trying to do the right thing. We want that, you know, good investment goes into good companies. And so, you know, so I think there is,
Yeah.
yes, one does need to shine light, but one needs to put it in context. And, you know, this is why when Gabriel was talking at the very beginning about, you know, there are these two bad companies that, you know, account for, you know, the bulk of badness. You know, I mean, this is an important fact. And, you know, that means that there are lots of companies who are not falling in this category. And all I'm saying is that, you know, we should not lose sight, because for investors to be there and banks to be there to finance a transition to a sustainable land use sector, we actually need them. And you know, the more they get scared, then this is sort of all this illegality and all of, you know, then who is going to pay for it? And then you have the risk that you have a deterioration of the situation, because only those banks and financial institutions writ large who don't care, they would continue to fund the, you know, the badness, and nobody is there to help with the transformation. So I think that is actually something there needs to be a balance about
Yeah.
the risks, but also about the opportunities. And this is where it's important to bring in other factors, you know, about, you know, what it means to actually produce the food that we need to eat, right? And how.
We have one more question. I think it would be important because it speaks to your issue, the issue that you raised. Like, there's an issue of scaring away the investors, that there's also this question of, like, how do we make sure that not only listed but unlisted companies disclose information? Meaning that, you know, if this is all about the listed company, the publicly traded company, but not about the middle, smaller company that's privately held, are we just fundamentally just pushing the problem in that bucket? And
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I mentioned the supply chain program earlier. I think that's kind of quite an effective way of doing that, because what you're doing is you're asking large listed companies to ask questions of their suppliers all through the value chain. And that's where you can bring the, you know, small and medium-sized companies. And actually, you know, it's not about beating them up. It's about working with them.
With them.
And asking them what they're doing. And essentially, by asking them to measure something, you're going to help them to try and improve that. And often the large companies who, clearly have a vested interest in that, are encouraged to push, best practice further down the chain. And I think that's a good way of bringing the sort of private people on board.
I would add that smaller companies are often more nimble, and they're more able to change. A company like Unilever has a population similar to the country of Iceland.
Yeah, and
Has a not a population. Sorry, is a employees that are similar to the population of Iceland. Thank you. Sorry about that.
So if I can, because we got 8 minutes left, and I just want to get to something, and then ask each one of you to give me your pitch. And I'm going to say something before, but I'll give you the time to think about it, which is, based on the conversation we had, I think we can agree that transparency has a big role, that has a big potential, but we don't want to go into a place where we have consciousness with paralysis, as Francis was saying, right? Where then we feel that the only thing we can do is to run away. So what would you ask the kind of stakeholders that are here, which is largely, to some extent, private sector and maybe some financial sector, but largely is government and NGOs, civil society. What should we do as a community that is convened in Oslo to do to actually push on this lever of transparency? What can we do and what should we do to really change this, really use it to change things, not at the margins, but as a big lever? What would be the one thing that we need to do? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first if you like. I mean, I like that analogy that Francis used this morning about, having a pail of water to fight a big fire. And actually you need, not just a few engines, but several engines and ladders to sort of tackle the problem. And I think that's what we really need. We need to sort of work together, and we need sort of system-wide change, to coin that phrase, to really make a radical difference. So, I think, we may not necessarily be able to get that system-wide change, at the first stab, but what you can do is you can scale up what you're doing. So, we want to scale up what we're doing on the disclosure side, scale up, provide the tools so we get a broader
more
audience.
Disclosure, more work in the tools.
No, sort of the right disclosure and the right tools for the audience to be able to, do something with that information. And that information doesn't necessarily have to be just investors. It could be the whole sort of banking system, and also it could be policymakers. I think we're all looking for the right thing. So it's really getting the targeted information. So it doesn't have to be big. It just has to be the right thing.
Sabine.
I think traceability would get us a long way. If everybody would be asking the next in line for traceability, whether it's the investors, could be one of their investment criteria, right? For the banks, could be one of the lending criteria. For financial, for NGOs, just find the one ask that people could
Ask for
around.
traceability.
Because, to me, traceability could address a lot of.
Simple criteria of disclosure, traceability be one of them, if not the one.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Traceability is one of the most important ones. But for the government side, I think push for more transparency, I think it is very, very important. I would like to give you good news from Indonesia. Only a few months ago, the president just signed presidential regulation of disclose of beneficial owners. So if you want to register new companies in Indonesia, then you have also to disclose who is actually the beneficial owner of those companies. Because we've been actually facing a lot of problems. For example, we are going to investigate on particular companies, but actually this been dissolved, and we don't really know who's belong to whom, these particular companies. Unfortunately, not many countries actually have similar regulations. UK is one of the good ones, not really good one, but at least we using it when draft this particular regulation. And not many other parts of the world that actually have that. If you look at Panama Papers and other things, it is very, very scary. And if you're talking about the financial institutions, we are in law enforcement agency. We are put in very, very dark situation, for example, in cryptocurrency. So, yeah, sometimes we are optimistic, but in other times, yeah, very, very pessimistic. But I think more transparency, it is better for not only for the corporations or the investors, but for the people in the planet. I think
Government
that's my closing.
transparency on licenses
Yeah.
and transparency of
Yeah.
ownership.
Yeah.
What I want, what is our vision, is that each and every one of you have access to data today on financial data and corporate governance data in ways that are meaningful to you. You may not like Excel, so I don't want to have to send you an Excel document with 100,000 data points. You may want something else, right? That's available now, so you can take action. We can't do this alone.
Yes.
And we need to work together in collaboration with each other, transparently. And when we think of, the second thing is that when we think of managing these risks and opportunities of the future, there are winners. There's a company, MP Evans, that trades on the London Stock Exchange. It transparently disclosed a third-party valuation of itself to fight off a hostile takeover by Kuala Lumpur Kempong a year and a half ago. Why was KLK trying to buy Evans? Because Evans had a functioning RSPO plantation that made sense. They had strong sustainability policies in place, and they were having action on the ground. This small company was able to iterate and be nimble and swift, right? Their share price went up 60%. 6-0. In 3.5 months. That's a very good return. So there are winners. Those who do disclose and are transparent are going to win. Another example with Chain Reaction Research, we worked with Unilever on the sale of to KKR, the private equity firm, of their baking, cooking, and spreads division.
KKR.
The suggested sale was $7 billion. We had a private conversation with some people at Unilever and suggested maybe you might want to consider selling to a private equity firm, if you choose, that with a similar or stronger sustainability commitment than you have as Unilever. Why? Because knowing what's in your supply chain allows for managing risks and opportunities in your supply chain. That's traceability and transparency. If you know what's there, you can deal with potential problems. The sale closed at $8 billion. There's a premium in there. We don't know what that price is. So transparency is valued in the market. We don't know how much exactly. And we know traceability is valued in the market. We don't know how much it's valued. But we can certainly say those both are valued. So those are going to be the winners. So we want you to have this information so you can take action and stop deforestation.
On this note, and I'm looking at Sabine, who wants to catch the end of the game. There's a hopeful note, and our time is out. I just want to thank the panelists for dedicating time to this very good discussion. And I hope we're coming out with a view that we can get more transparency, and that transparency can create value if we focus on traceability and on government transparency. Thank you very much, and help me give a hand to our panelists.